Imam Ghazali says the wise Muslim thinker is the one whose insight, his internal firasa has been purified. A certain kind of firasa, a spiritual insight is required to enable us to pick and choose, to find what is pure gold and to recognize that from what is forgery. That, it seems to me, is the gift that Muslim scholars are required to cultivate. Modernity represents a spectrum of possibilities, not a single point of view. So certain of these things do speak to us, and even though at times certain contemporary forms of expressing wisdom may seem to sound truer in our ears than certain replications of medieval formulas, we need to acquire this capacity for tamyiz, for discernment. How do we tell what is gold from what is false gold when so many people have been misled? When the world is full of people who simply have not been able to make the right decisions. People who are loosely labelled fundamentalists on the one hand and reject the modern world on moral grounds, but may be completely entranced by its science. Various forms of fundamentalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, various forms of liberalism and modernism on the other. Neither of those represent a correct sifting of the true from the false gold. What is required is something that will recognize that al-hikmah walatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost riding beast of the believer, a concept, a formulation, a scientific insight, biological wisdom may be developed by an unbelieving mind. But when the believer appropriates it and sees what it means in terms of its belongingness to the pattern of Allah's creation, it is the believer who truly owns that concept. Now, the ability to make that discernment of spirits, that tamyiz, is the subtlest thing, and the area in which many modern Muslim thinkers have not done terribly well. Because what Imam al-Ghazali is proposing is that a firasa is required, an intuition, that we have to know through this discernment of spirits what is a positive, contemporary form of religious expression and what is subversive. Huge responsibility, but one that we have no alternative to taking on. And his interpretation is that it is the fitrah, the fundamental positive disposition, the theomorphic essence of the base of the human consciousness, which is the basis for making those decisions. Which means that if the human consciousness is overcome by moral weakness or by complexes of envy, insecurity, anger, defensiveness, that we all make the wrong decisions. And the great calamity of the Ummah at the moment is a mindset which, based on the understandable believing aversion to the triviality of the modern world, wishes to reject every aspect of its discourse while adopting uncritically the scientific foundations of that discourse. And this is the ideology of Islamic radicalism, of fundamentalism, which is ultimately an expression of ego, of nafs. Its basic rage, its hamiyya, is the hamiyya of the jahiliyyah. It is that envy and resentment that existed amongst the tribes of the ancient Arabs. It is that sense of primacy and envy and insecurity that was the mindset of Fir'aun. It is the mentality of the other side. This hamiyya, this rage, this envy is the jahili quality. And when that jahili energy, which is from the nafs, which is from the ego, which is from our insecurity, from our fearfulness of the other, is turned into the driving energy of religion, then that is the most profound subversion that can ever take place. And the ugliest things on the planet are those manifestations of religion that are driven by ego rather than by the spirit. That is a huge danger. The Kharijite energy which emerged at the beginning of the religion. Kalimatu haqqin urida biha batil, a true word by which batil, falsehood, is deeply intended. Yamruquna min al-deen kama yamruqu as-sahmu min al-ramiyya, the famous hadith of Dhul-Khuwaysira, which the ulama always invoke as an indication of that particular mindset. Such people go into religion so hard that they come out the other side like an arrow through its target. And the nature of that hardness is precisely the anger and the rage, the frustration, the insecurity, the psychic traumas of the overwhelmed citizen of the third world when he sees the superior technique of his historical enemies. That is the inversion of true religion. It is the importation of the Jahili principle of rage and envy and hamiyya into the spiritual metabolism of Islam, and its results are the Khariji mindset that opposed Imam Ali and eventually resulted in his assassination, if one could imagine a greater crime. That is where it ends. It ends in self-destruction, in suicidal tendencies. That is one possibility which we see when this wisdom, this capacity to sort out the true gold from the false gold, is not cultivated. And the opposite pole is that of the uncritical acceptance of modernity, the envy of modernity again, the assumption being that what we need to do is to become just like them, but perhaps keeping the hijab and keeping certain of our traditions intact, but the underlying logic of legislation, the values, the priority of life being indistinguishable from those of the secular world. That also is symptomatic of a fundamental loss of wisdom and of hikmah, and also of yaqeen. What's required, as always, and this is very much the Ghazalian way, is the way of the middle. Khayrul umuri awsatuha, the best of all matters is the middle course. Imam Ghazali explains that that is not the same as the easiest course. It is quite easy to switch your mind off and be the uncritical imitator of a fundamentalist faction, one of whose conditions for membership is that you don't use your brain any longer. Or to be the uncritical follower of some liberal faction that assumes that basically the discourse of the modern world is where Muslims need to be, and again, you don't need a critical faculty any longer. To be in the middle is actually the hardest place to be. And it's the sirat al-mustaqim, the path of those who are غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين, one of whose meanings is presumably, one can say, by ta'wil, precisely this. And that sirat al-mustaqim is a tricky place to be, but its compensation is that it is a place where you will find this tuma'nina, where you will find exclusively this ease in the soul. The enraged radical will not find that calmness in his soul, with which the Quran speaks. And the mindless liberal, the modernist, the conformist, will not find that calmness in his soul, because deep down he knows that he's missing something and that he is a sellout. He has the guilt of the traitor gnawing away in his soul at some level. He'll never quite be able to get away from that. But the one who is in the state of al-qalb al-salim is the one who has found this middle path. What flourishes under modern conditions is either mindless fundamentalism or mindless conformism to the growing modern consumerist monoculture. That's what thrives nowadays. What doesn't thrive is wisdom, beauty, truth, tradition, selflessness, and humility. Those are the rare properties, but those are undeniably properties which the Sirat al-Mustaqim enjoins upon us. But that's the true nature of Islamic intellectuality in our age. It's to recognize that the believer is between these 2 points, but is not a moderate. That the believer's radicalism consists in his being at the middle, and consists in his ability to use a deeper wisdom that has nothing to do with the modern trivial definition of human consciousness. The collapse of the Enlightenment self, much wanted, now turns to nothing. But the access to a deeper wisdom, which is ultimately this nostalgia, this yearning for the alastu bi rabbikum, and the desire for al-qalb al-salim, which is at the basis of our souls.